The wrench slammed into the seized bolt, blood dripping from my split knuckles. Two of my father's associates were tearing through the shed, desperate for the lockbox I'd just pried from the wreckage. My only weapon? A rusted chain and the truth I wasn't supposed to know. If they got that box, I'd lose more than the ranch. I'd lose the proof my father stole my future. The dust cloud on the horizon wasn't just debt collectors. It was the end of everything. The wrench slipped, skinning Caleb's knuckles against the jagged iron of the manifold. He didn't curse. Instead, he wiped the grease and blood onto his denim thighs, staring at the rusted carcass of the John Deere. Heat shimmered off the Nebraska dirt, carrying the scent of parched earth and sour diesel. A grasshopper clicked in the tall, yellowed weeds, the only sound across the empty acres except for the rhythmic clank of his own heavy breathing. Caleb leaned into the engine bay, his fingers fumbling with a stripped bolt. He searched for leverage in a space too small for a man who had spent 40 years hauling hay, though he was only 24. The metal burned his palms. Underneath the grime, the tractor's skeletal frame groaned, a hollow echo of the bank account currently sitting at zero. He reached back, his fingers brushing the cold, rusted 5/8-inch wrench tucked into his back pocket. The weight of the steel was the only thing that felt real, a tether to a world that wasn't dissolving into debt and dust. The horizon was a heavy iron bar, pinning the sky against the flat earth until the scale of it felt like a physical weight. Caleb squinted against the glare. Far off, at the edge of the property where the gravel road met the dying grass, a plume of dust began to rise. It wasn't the swirling, chaotic dance of a dust devil. It was thick, low, and steady. A vehicle. His heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He didn't need to see the make or model to know what it was. The debt collectors. They were like vultures that had learned to drive, circling the carcass of the Miller Ranch, waiting for the last bit of life to twitch out of the soil. Caleb wiped a dark smear of oil across his forehead, his jaw clenching until his teeth ached. He had worked 18-hour days, mending fences that refused to stay mended and coaxing life out of machines that should have been scrap metal decades ago. The truck grew larger, a black speck becoming a predatory shape. Caleb looked at the irrigation pump sitting nearby, its throat choked with silt and rust. If he didn't get the water moving, the remaining crop would shrivel by Tuesday. But the pump was seized. The tractor was gutted, and the men in that truck didn't care about the price of corn or the depth of the well. They only cared about the ledger. Caleb gripped his wrench, the metal biting into his calloused palm, and waited for the dust to settle. The truck pulled to a halt, the engine cutting out with a wheezing sigh that sounded like a mockery of Caleb's own exhaustion. Two men stepped out. They weren't wearing suits. They wore heavy canvas jackets and boots that hadn't seen a day of real farm work. They looked like the kind of men Silas used to consult with, men who specialized in the weight of a shadow and the snap of a bone. Caleb didn't move from the tractor. He watched them through the skeleton of the engine block. "Property's closed," he said, his voice sandpaper dry. The taller one, a man with a neck like a bull and eyes that stayed fixed on the farmhouse, spat a glob of tobacco juice into the dirt. "We aren't here for the scenery, kid. We're here for the collateral." Silas said the shed was fair game. Caleb's grip tightened on the wrench. Silas. It was always Silas, promising pieces of a life he hadn't bled for. The men started toward the collapsed shed at the edge of the yard, a jagged heap of cedar and rusted tin that had succumbed to a windstorm 3 months back. Caleb knew what was in there. Mostly scrap, but also the few things of his mother's that he'd managed to hide. "Stay out of the shed." Caleb said, stepping down from the tractor. His boots hit the dirt with a solid thud. The men didn't stop. They moved with a practiced, thuggish indifference. Caleb felt a surge of heat that had nothing to do with the Nebraska sun. It was the heat of a machine redlining, the smell of scorched oil and impending failure. He started toward them, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy chain draped over the tractor's hitch. The struggle was short and ugly. The bull-necked man swung a heavy fist that caught Caleb in the ribs, knocking the wind out of him in a sickening whoosh. Caleb stumbled, the taste of copper filling his mouth, but his fingers found the cold links of the chain. He didn't think. He reacted with the precision of a man who spent his life fighting stubborn iron. He swung the chain in a low, heavy arc. It hissed through the air and cracked against the man's shin with a sound like a dry branch snapping. The man screamed, a raw, jagged sound that tore through the quiet of the afternoon. The second associate lunged, but Caleb was already moving, fueled by a decade of quiet resentment. He used the momentum of the chain to sweep the man's legs out from under him. They hit the mud, thick, oily sludge from a leaking pipe, and for a moment, the yard was a chaos of grunts and the wet slap of bodies hitting the earth. Caleb stood over them, chest heaving, the chain wrapped twice around his fist. His knuckles were raw, his shirt torn, but he didn't back down. The men scrambled back toward their truck, the taller one limping heavily, his face twisted in a mask of shock. They hadn't expected the unstable boy to fight back with such mechanical efficiency. As the truck roared away, kicking up a fresh veil of grit, Caleb's eyes drifted to the wreckage of the shed. In the spot where the men had been digging, a corner of dull metal peeked through the splintered wood and dirt. He dropped the chain, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to ebb. He moved to the debris, pulling away the heavy beams until he could reach the object. It was a lockbox, rusted shut and caked in grime. It felt heavy, but not with the weight of gold or coins. It felt dense, like a secret kept too long in the dark. Caleb hauled it out, his heart performing a frantic, irregular beat against his bruised ribs. He didn't open it yet. He just sat there in the dirt, the smell of scorched dust and old wood surrounding him, clutching the box to his chest. The sound of a familiar engine, a clean, well-maintained hum, broke the silence. Sarah Thompson's white SUV pulled into the driveway. She was out of the door before the engine had fully died, her stethoscope draped over her neck like a silver scarf against the heat. "Caleb, what happened to your face?" she called out, her voice fast and sharp, already 3 steps ahead of the situation. She reached him and immediately began poking at his ribs, her brow furrowed in a permanent line of concern. "Just some grit in the oil, Sarah," Caleb muttered, trying to pull away. "I'm fine." "You aren't fine. You're bleeding, and you look like you've been run over by your own plow." She ignored his protests, pulling a kit from her bag. As she dabbed antiseptic onto his knuckles, her expression shifted from professional to grim. "I was at the county office today, Caleb. I was looking for those vet records for the cattle. But I stumbled onto something else. Something about the ranch's ledger." Caleb looked up, his eyes narrowing. "The debt? I know it's bad." "No," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not just bad. It's fake. Silas hasn't paid a dime in property taxes in 4 years. Every cent you've been handing him, every hour of overtime you put in to save the land, he's been pocketing it. He's letting the ranch slide into foreclosure on purpose, Caleb. He's orchestrating the downfall." The words hit Caleb harder than the man's fist. He looked down at the lockbox in his lap. The metal felt colder now, even in the sun. He reached into his back pocket, his fingers finding the 5/8-inch wrench. He used the flat head of the tool to pry at the rusted latch of the box. The metal groaned, resisting, then gave way with a sharp, metallic snap. Caleb pulled the lid back. There was no money inside, no deeds, just a stack of papers, yellowed at the edges, but kept dry by a plastic sleeve. On top was a heavy envelope with a crest he recognized from the brochures he used to hide under his mattress when he was 17. Stanford University. He pulled it out. It was an acceptance letter, dated 3 years ago. Full ride scholarship awarded to Caleb Miller. Caleb stared at the words until they blurred. He remembered the day the rejection had come. Silas had sat him down, a heavy hand on his shoulder, popping his knuckles in that rhythmic, terrifying sequence. Index to pinky. Silas had told him his grades weren't enough, that his reckless nature had turned the recruiters away, and that the only way to redeem himself was to stay and work off the debt his father had supposedly taken on to pay for his failures. He lied, Caleb whispered. The paper crinkled in his grease-stained hands. He didn't just hide it. He stole 3 years of my life. Sarah leaned in, her eyes wide as she read the letter over his shoulder. Caleb, this isn't just a lie. This is a prison sentence. Caleb didn't respond. He stood up, the letter clutched in one hand and the rusted wrench in the other. He looked toward the farmhouse, where the shadow of the lightning rods pointed like accusing fingers toward the porch. The ranch wasn't a home. It was a machine designed to grind him into the dirt, and Silas Miller was the one holding the crank. The heat intensified as the afternoon wore on, the air becoming a shimmering wall of gold and dust. Silas's truck eventually rattled up the drive, the sound of the engine a low, predatory growl. He stepped out, adjusting his hat, his eyes immediately sweeping over the yard, noting the disturbed dirt near the shed and the blood on Caleb's shirt. "Looks like you had some company, son," Silas said, his voice like gravel grinding in a mixer. He walked toward Caleb, his movement slow and deliberate. He stopped just a few feet away, leaning into Caleb's personal space. "Those boys from the agency. They can be a bit overzealous. I told them we were a team. But they see a ledger in the red, and they lose their manners." Caleb kept his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his hand buried in his pocket, gripping the wrench. He didn't mention the letter. He didn't mention the taxes. He just watched Silas's hands. Silas began to crack his knuckles. Pop, 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 pop. "The thing is, Caleb, the bank is pushing harder. I might have to sell the cattle, the whole herd. It's the only way to cover the new interest." The cattle were the only living thing on the ranch Caleb still cared about. They were the only part of the job that didn't feel like a slow death. "You can't sell the herd, Silas. We need them for the fall auction." "We need to stay out of jail, boy." Silas's voice boomed, then immediately dropped back to a conspiratorial whisper. "I had a bit of a run at the tables in town. A temporary setback. But the debt is ours to share, isn't it? Blood is thicker than water, Caleb. But it's thinner than the truth I keep for you." Caleb felt the familiar bile rising in his throat. He wanted to scream, to shove the Stanford letter into Silas's face and watch him try to talk his way out of it. But he stayed silent. He knew Silas. If he showed his hand now, Silas would find a way to burn the cards. "I'll fix the pump," Caleb said, his voice flat. "Just leave the cattle alone." Silas smiled, a thin, oily expression that didn't reach his predatory eyes. "That's my boy. Always thinking of the work. I'll be on the porch if you need me. My heart's been acting up again. The stress of the debt, you know." It's a heavy cross to bear. Caleb watched him walk away, the old man's shadow engulfing the broken tractor. He waited until the screen door slammed shut before he headed toward his truck. He needed to get to town. He needed to see a lawyer or a cop or anyone who didn't have the last name Miller. Subverted beat 2.2. Caleb hopped into his truck, the engine turning over with a reluctant roar. He had the Stanford letter tucked into his waistband and a fire in his chest that felt like it could melt the steering wheel. He was done. He was going to the county seat, and he wasn't coming back until he had an injunction or a sheriff at his side. He shifted into reverse, his eyes fixed on the driveway. This was the smartest move he'd ever made. No more arguing. No more fixing things that were meant to stay broken. He would let the professionals handle Silas. He felt a rare spark of hope, a lightness in his limbs he hadn't felt since he was 18. He was finally taking control. As he began to back up, he saw Silas step out onto the porch. The old man looked frail in the harsh light, his hand clutching his chest. He took one step, then another, his face contorting into a mask of agony. He let out a choked, guttural cry that carried across the yard, and then his knees buckled. He hit the porch boards with a heavy, sickening thud, his body twitching once before going still. Caleb slammed on the brakes. "Silas?" he shouted, leaning out the window. There was no answer. Silas lay there, one arm hanging limp over the edge of the porch, his chest barely moving. Caleb's grip on the steering wheel turned his knuckles white. "It's a trick," he told himself. "It has to be a trick." But then he remembered the doctor's visits Silas had been faking for months, the heart medication bottles on the nightstand. If Silas died right here, the ranch would go into probate. The debt would swallow everything. And Caleb would be the one the town blamed for leaving his father to die in the dirt. He felt the hope drain out of him, replaced by a cold, leaden weight of duty. He couldn't leave an old man to die, even a monster. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. He jumped out of the truck and ran to the porch, his mind racing through the CPR steps Sarah had taught him. He reached Silas and knelt in the dust. "Silas, can you hear me?" The old man's eyes were rolled back, his skin a pale, waxy gray. Caleb grabbed his wrist, searching for a pulse. It was there, thready, irregular, but present. He began to rub Silas's sternum, his own heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm here, Silas. I'm here." Slowly, the old man's eyes flickered open. He looked at Caleb, his expression one of profound, pathetic confusion. "Caleb? Is that you, son?" "Yeah, it's me. Don't move. I'm calling Sarah." Silas reached out, his fingers trembling as they gripped Caleb's forearm. No doctors. Can't afford the bill. Just help me inside. Don't leave me, boy. Please, I'm so cold." Caleb felt a wave of crushing guilt. How could he have thought about leaving? The man was a liar and a thief, but he was dying. Caleb gathered the old man into his arms. He was surprisingly light, like a bundle of dry sticks, and carried him into the house. He spent the next 4 hours sitting by Silas's bed, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the bedroom walls. Silas seemed to stabilize, his breathing becoming deep and even. Caleb leaned back in the chair, his eyes burning with exhaustion. He had missed his window. The county offices were closed. The lawyer would be gone. He stood up to stretch his cramped legs and walked to the window. In the dying light, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. Silas's truck was parked near the barn. From this angle, Caleb could see the shadow of someone moving near his own truck. He squinted. It was Robert Evans, one of Silas's old associates, the man who smelled of sugar and desperation. Robert was kneeling by Caleb's front tire. There was a glint of metal, a sharp hiss of escaping air, and then the truck sagged to the left. Caleb spun around to look at the bed. Silas wasn't there. The bed was empty, the covers thrown back. The dying man was gone. Caleb heard the heavy thunk of the front door being bolted from the outside. Then the back door. Then the rhythmic click, click, click of Silas popping his knuckles in the hallway. "You always were too soft, Caleb." Silas's voice came through the thick oak of the bedroom door. The frailty was gone, replaced by a cold, vibrating authority. "You think I didn't see you digging in that shed? You think I didn't know you found your little letter?" Caleb lunged for the door, grabbing the handle. It didn't budge. "Open the door, Silas. Open it now." "I'm doing this for your own good, son. You're agitated. You're seeing things that aren't there. Stanford? Scholarships? That's the talk of a boy whose mind has finally snapped under the pressure of the debt. I've already called the sheriff. Told him you had a breakdown. Told him you tried to attack me." Caleb slammed his shoulder against the door. But the old house was built of solid timber, and the bolt held firm. He ran to the window, but he saw Robert Evans standing in the yard, a heavy tire iron in his hand, watching the house with a hungry, predatory grin. Caleb was trapped. The ranch had become a physical prison, the horizon no longer a promise of escape, but the wall of a cell. He reached back and touched the wrench in his pocket. It was the only thing Silas hadn't taken. Yet, the night was a long, suffocating wait. Caleb didn't sleep. He paced the small perimeter of his bedroom, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He tried the window, but it was an old sash style that had been painted shut for decades, and Robert was still out there, a shadow among shadows. By dawn, the heat was already rising, a dry, searing promise of the day to come. Caleb knew he couldn't wait for Silas to decide his fate. He looked at the small bathroom attached to the bedroom. There was a tiny window there, barely wide enough for a man of his build, used for ventilation. It was high up near the ceiling. He moved into the bathroom, his movements quiet and deliberate. He stood on the toilet, reaching for the latch. It was rusted, but with a sharp tug and the help of his 5/8-inch wrench, it gave way. He wiggled through, the rough wood scraping his skin, until he tumbled out into the tall weeds behind the house. He didn't head for the driveway. He knew the roads would be watched. Instead, he ran through the corn canyon, the dry leaves thwacking against his arms like frantic, bony fingers. He reached the main road and flagged down a passing motorist, an old farmer in a battered Ford who didn't ask questions about the blood on Caleb's shirt. "Just to the diner in town," Caleb said, his voice cracking. The drive was a blur of green and gold. But as they reached the sharp curve near the creek, a black sedan emerged from the cornstalks. It didn't slow down. It accelerated, the engine a high-pitched whine. "Look out!" Caleb yelled. But it was too late. The sedan slammed into the rear quarter panel of the Ford. The world tilted. There was the scream of metal on metal, the shattering of glass, and then the sickening sensation of weightlessness. The truck rolled once, twice, and came to rest in a deep drainage ditch, the wheels spinning uselessly against the sky. Caleb crawled out of the wreckage, his head spinning, the smell of gasoline and scorched dust filling his lungs. The black sedan was gone, a vanishing speck on the horizon. He didn't wait. He scrambled up the embankment and began to walk, his limp heavy, his mind focused on one name: Mrs. Higgins. He found her at a secluded roadside diner on the edge of town, a place where the coffee tasted like battery acid and the booths were cracked vinyl. Mrs. Higgins was sitting in the corner, her silver hair a sharp military bob, her posture rigid as she counted the sugar packets on the table. 10, 11, 12, she whispered as Caleb slid into the booth opposite her. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she took in his disheveled appearance. "You look like a man who's been through a thresher. Caleb Miller?" "Silas," Caleb gasped, clutching a glass of water. "He's got the ranch locked down. He's telling people I'm crazy." Mrs. Higgins sighed, a sound of profound, weary disappointment. She reached into her large, structured purse and pulled out a manila folder. "I've been waiting for you to come to me, Caleb. I've lived with my own silence for 30 years, watching men like Silas devour the world. I won't do it anymore." She opened the folder, revealing a stack of legal documents. "He wasn't just hiding your mail, Caleb. He was intercepting the court summons, the bank, the county, the estate lawyers. They've been trying to reach you for years. But Silas made sure those letters never touched your hands." Caleb flipped through the papers, his eyes blurring. It was all there. Notices of inheritance, tax warnings, legal inquiries. But then he stopped. At the bottom of the stack was a document with a heavy blue seal. "Subverted Beat 2.6. Mrs. Higgins pushed the document toward him. This is what he was really hiding. He didn't just want the land, Caleb. He wanted the authority. Caleb read the header, Declaration of Incompetency and Appointment of Guardian. His heart skipped a beat. He looked at the signature line. There, in a shaky but unmistakable hand, was his own name. Caleb Miller. "I never signed this," he whispered. "I would never sign this." "He forged it, Caleb," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice a rhythmic, calming whisper. "But he didn't just forge a signature. He had it notarized by a man he owes gambling debts to. Legally, according to the state of Nebraska, you don't exist as a functional adult. Silas has total control over your assets, your medical decisions, and your right to even step foot in a courtroom." Caleb felt a surge of relief. "But we can prove it's a forgery. We have the Stanford letter. We have the tax records Sarah found. If we go to the judge now—" "Caleb, listen to me," Mrs. Higgins interrupted, her hand resting on his arm. "This document was filed 18 months ago. Under the law, you had 90 days to contest it. Because you didn't, the guardianship became absolute. In the eyes of the law, any evidence you bring forward now is considered the delusions of an unstable ward. You can't sue him. You can't fire him. You can't even hire a lawyer without his signature." The relief vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating realization. He had thought the letter was his ticket out. He had thought the truth would set him free. But Silas had used the truth to build a cage that was perfectly legal. "So I'm a prisoner?" Caleb asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the diner's refrigerator. "On paper, yes," Mrs. Higgins said. "He's stripped you of your autonomy. He's turned you into a ghost in your own life. And if you try to fight him now, he'll have you committed to a state facility for evaluation. He's already paved the way with the sheriff." Caleb looked out the window. The sun was high and brutal, bleaching the color out of the world. He reached back and touched the wrench in his pocket. It felt small, insignificant. A piece of scrap metal in a world built on paper and lies. "There has to be a way out," he said. "There is," Mrs. Higgins whispered, her eyes fixed on the door. "But it's not in a courtroom. You have to find the original will, Caleb. The one your mother wrote before she died. Silas destroyed the copies, but he's a hoarder of power. He kept the original in a lockbox in the barn. If you can get that, if you can show the world what she really intended, the forgery won't matter. But you have to do it before he sells the land. Caleb nodded. He didn't have a truck, he didn't have a name, and he didn't have a future. All he had was a 5/8-inch wrench and a desperate need to burn the cage down. The storm began as a low, bruised purple smudge on the western horizon, a silent wall of thunder that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. By the time Caleb made it back to the ranch, sneaking through the drainage ditches and the tall, browning corn, the wind was a rhythmic thrumming against his teeth. He reached the edge of the yard, staying low. The house was dark, but a single light flickered in the study. Caleb crept toward the window, his heart a frantic bird in a cage of ribs. He looked inside and saw Silas sitting at the desk, a glass of amber liquid in one hand and a thick, multi-page contract in the other. Caleb squinted, trying to read the bold print at the top of the page. Waste Management and Land Reclamation Agreement. His stomach turned. A waste dump. Silas wasn't just selling the land, he was selling its soul. He was going to let them bury the poison of the city in the soil Caleb had bled for. It was the final insult, the ultimate betrayal of everything his mother had tried to protect. Caleb didn't go to the house. He headed for the barn. The air smelled of ozone and scorched dust, the first fat drops of rain splattering against the dry earth like bullets. He stepped into the cavernous dark of the barn, the scent of old hay and diesel surrounding him. I knew you'd come back for it. A voice rasped from the shadows. Caleb froze. Silas stepped out from behind the combine, a pitchfork in his hand, the tines gleaming in the flashes of lightning that now ripped through the sky. He didn't look frail anymore. He looked energized, his predatory eyes wide with a manic, terrifying light. You're predictable, Caleb. Just like your mother, always trying to save things that are already dead. Silas stepped closer, the pitchfork held low. You want the will? You want the scholarship? It's all right here. He kicked a small, sturdy lockbox, different from the one Caleb had found in the shed, across the floor. But there's a ticking clock, son. That scholarship? The one you think is your golden ticket? Michael Reed, that little lawyer in town, he told me it's still on deferred status, a clerical error in your favor. If you can get to a notary by midnight, you can still claim it. But look at the time, Caleb, and look at the weather. A crack of thunder shook the barn, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. Caleb lunged for the box, but Silas was faster. He swung the pitchfork, the heavy wood handle catching Caleb in the chest and pinning him against the rough timber of the wall. You aren't going anywhere. Silas hissed, his face inches from Caleb's. You're staying here. You're going to watch them dig the pits. You're going to watch the soil turn black. And then, when I'm done with you, I'll let the state take you away to a nice, quiet room where you can count the stairs all day long. Caleb struggled, the cold metal of the pitchfork tines biting into his shirt. Why, Silas? Why do you hate me this much? Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. I don't hate you, boy. I don't feel anything for you at all. You're just a resource, like the cattle, like the corn. And resources are meant to be used until they're dry. He leaned in closer, his voice a low, mocking whisper. You want to know the best part? Your mother, she thought she was so smart. She left it all to you, every acre, every cent. I've been spending your money for 10 years, Caleb. I've been forging your name on checks while you were out there mending my fences for a nickel an hour. You were a millionaire in rags, and you never even knew it. Silas pulled back, his eyes catching a flash of lightning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a kerosene lantern. He struck a match, the small flame dancing in the wind that howled through the gaps in the barn walls. But a will doesn't matter if there's no one left to claim it, Silas said. And if the evidence burns, well, then the truth is whatever I say it is. He deliberately knocked the lantern over. The glass shattered, the kerosene spreading across the dry hay in a hungry, blue-tinged wave. The fire took hold instantly, a wall of orange heat erupting between Caleb and the exit. Silas backed away toward the side door, his face illuminated by the growing inferno. "Goodbye, Caleb. Tell your mother I said thanks for the land." He stepped out and slammed the heavy barn doors shut. Caleb heard the solid clack of the external bolt sliding into place. The heat was immediate, a physical blow that sucked the moisture from his eyes. Smoke began to fill the rafters, thick and black. Caleb lunged for the doors, throwing his weight against them, but they were reinforced oak, built to withstand a Nebraska blizzard. They didn't even shiver. A heavy support beam, weakened by years of rot and now licked by the flames, groaned above him. Caleb looked up just as the timber gave way. He tried to dive, but the beam caught him across the legs, pinning him to the wooden floor. He let out a scream of agony, the weight of the burning wood crushing his shins. The fire was spreading, the roar of the flames drowning out the thunder outside. He looked through the smoke and saw Silas through the small window in the door, standing in the rain, watching the barn burn with a look of calm, satisfied indifference. Caleb reached back, his fingers trembling as they found the 5/8-inch wrench in his pocket. He looked at the heavy hydraulic jack attached to the old tractor just a few feet away. He couldn't reach the handle, but he could reach the pressure valve. He began to crawl, the heat blistering his skin, dragging his pinned legs behind him. Every inch was a battle against the dark. He reached the jack, his fingers fumbling with the valve. He jammed the wrench into the mechanism, using it as a lever. 1 turn, 2 turns. The jack began to rise, the heavy steel arm pushing against the fallen beam. The wood groaned, the pressure shifting. Caleb felt the weight lift, just enough. He pulled his legs free, the pain a white-hot flare in his mind. He didn't head for the doors. He knew they were a trap. Instead, he crawled toward the back of the barn, where the old irrigation pipes ran through the foundation. He used the wrench to smash the rusted coupling, a geyser of muddy, silt-choked water erupting into the heat. It wasn't enough to put out the fire, but it gave him a path. He tumbled out of the back of the barn and into the mud, just as the roof collapsed in a spectacular shower of sparks and ash. He lay there in the rain, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps, the smell of scorched hair and wet earth surrounding him. He looked up and saw Silas standing on the porch of the farmhouse, his back to the fire, looking toward the road. He was waiting for the sirens. He was waiting to play the part of the grieving father who had tried to save his troubled son from his own madness. Caleb stood up. His legs were a mess of bruises and burns, but he could walk. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bottle he had snatched from Silas's bedside table during the heart attack. He walked toward the porch, his movements slow and deliberate. Silas didn't see him until he was at the bottom of the steps. The old man's face went pale, his jaw dropping. You should be dead." "The grease is part of the bone now, Silas," Caleb said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He held up the bottle. "This isn't heart medicine. I checked the label Sarah gave me. It's a specialized beta blocker. If you take enough of it, it mimics the symptoms of a coronary event perfectly. You weren't dying, Silas. You were just drugging yourself to keep me in the cage." Silas began to crack his knuckles. Pop, pop. But the sound was hollow now, the rhythm broken. It doesn't matter. The will is gone. The contract is signed. Who are they going to believe? A pillar of the community, or a boy who just burned down his own barn in a fit of rage? Caleb smiled, a hard, cold expression that looked nothing like the boy Silas had spent a decade breaking. The will isn't gone, Silas. My mother didn't just leave it in the barn. She left a copy with Michael Reed. And those debt collectors you were so afraid of? They weren't from the bank. They were lawyers from her estate. They've been trying to serve you papers for a year, but you kept running them off with a gun. He stepped up onto the porch, his shadow engulfing the smaller man. I don't need to fight you, Silas. I don't even need to hate you, because you're already irrelevant. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys to the rusted truck. He tossed them at Silas's feet. You have 10 minutes. The sheriff is on his way for the arson. Sarah is on her way with the tax records, and Mrs. Higgins is waiting at the courthouse with the forgery proof. Silas looked at the keys, then at the burning ruins of the barn, then back at Caleb. For the first time in his life, the predatory light in his eyes flickered and died. He was just an old man in a cheap suit, standing on a porch that didn't belong to him. You're leaving? Silas whispered. After everything I did for you? I'm not leaving, Caleb said, looking out toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to break through the storm clouds. I'm just moving on. Caleb watched the rusted truck disappear down the gravel road, the sound of the engine fading into the vast, empty quiet of the Nebraska morning. He stood on the porch, the scent of parched earth and rain-washed air filling his lungs. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. Sarah? It's me. Yeah, I'm okay. Listen, call the Nature Conservancy. Tell them the land is for sale, all of it. I want the soil to stay soil. No dumps, no poison. He paused, looking at his hands. They were still stained with grease and blood, the dirt of the ranch etched into the lines of his palms. He reached back and touched the 5/8-inch wrench in his back pocket. He pulled it out and looked at it. A simple piece of steel, rusted but unbreakable. He didn't need it anymore. He set the wrench on the porch railing and walked toward the white SUV Sarah had left for him. He didn't look back at the charred remains of the barn or the sagging fence lines. He looked west, toward the white void on the map where the destination should be. The debt was paid. The machine was broken. And for the first time in 24 years, Caleb Miller was free to be whatever he wanted to be.